Our minds and bodies are designed to heal. What's interfering with it is the mind is so actively going over and trying to resolve this trauma that it doesn't want to do maintenance. It wants to do minimal maintenance because it wants all that energy to be working on resolving this trauma. So when you relieve that, health improves.
Hello, my friends, and welcome back to yet another episode of I Love Being Sober. My name's Tim Westbrook, and I'm the CEO of Camelback Recovery here in the always sunny and always sober Scottsdale, Arizona, where my team and I, over the course of many years, have helped thousands of people on their path to recovery. We started this show because there's so much misinformation about addiction treatment, mental illness, and recovery in general. There's so much more to recovery than just going to inpatient treatment, seeing a therapist, and going to 12-step meetings. All of those things are important, and AA saved my life. However, to find long-term recovery and live happy, joyous, and free, there's a lot more to it than just stopping the drinking, stopping the drugs, stopping the sex addiction, or stopping any addictive behavior for that matter. To live a new life, a person needs new, healthy lifestyle habits, amongst other things, in order to get there. Typically, this includes new eating habits, new exercise habits, new sleeping habits, new hobbies, new interests, new friends. Self-care becomes a priority, and the list goes on. Those are the types of things we talk about here on the show, amongst other things. And today I'm here with Dr. Don Wood, Ph.D., to discuss the Inspired Performance Program, also known as TIP. Dr. Wood has helped trauma survivors from the Boston Marathon bombing attack, the Las Vegas shooting, and many successful executives and world-class athletes. Mark Chisetto, a double marathon amputee marathon runner, broke the world record twice after completing TIP. Chris Nikic worked with Dr. Wood and made world news by becoming the first person with Down syndrome to complete an Ironman. The Inspired Performance Institute was built on the simple phrase, there's nothing wrong with you, there's nothing wrong with your mind. Rather, during your lifetime, some events and experiences have created some glitches and error messages for your mind, and all you need is a reboot. Dr. Wood, welcome to the show. I'm so glad to have you here.
That's great, Tim. Thank you so much. I know we've been talking for a little while about getting together and doing this, so I'm excited to be here.
We have, and I'm grateful that you're here, and finally it worked out. So you're here. So I guess we'll just dig into it. Yep. What gives you the right to claim you're an expert on the healing of trauma?
It really started because of my experience with my wife and my daughter. My wife had experienced trauma as a child. I never did. I didn't have any trauma. And so, bumped along the way, but nothing could be considered trauma that she dealt with. She had a very violent home, very angry father. And then my daughter ended up with Crohn's and another autoimmune called idiopathic pulmonary hemosiderosis. So what I did is, in trying to find solutions more for my daughter, I started researching and made the connection between trauma and inflammation, and this unresolved trauma then starts to it affects your immune system and neurotransmitters. So people will start getting sicker because their immune system's compromised, and the neurotransmitters, they'll start feeling bad. So they're going to be looking for ways to try to help relieve that. And everything was all built around teaching people to live and manage and cope with it. And I said, why aren't we fixing it? Mm-hmm. And so that's what I did, is I developed a program to heal the trauma so that it didn't continue to affect our day-to-day lives.
Okay, so the next question I was going to ask you, what specific incident inspired you to be so passionate about this topic? But I guess you already kind of answered that question. Yeah. So trauma is all around us, and many people say that trauma is at the root of all addiction. And so to heal trauma and just to figure out a way to heal the trauma seems like a really big thing that you've been able to figure out how to do. And I'm just like, how did that work out? How were you able to figure out how to heal trauma or process trauma or get through the trauma?
Well, I started to study what was currently being done. And like I said, everything was all really built around managing it. So if people would say, well, I have anxiety. Well, we're going to teach you how to live with anxiety. We're going to give you medication, right? Or I have depression. We're going to give you antidepressants, anti-anxiety medication. And what I was saying is that's not fixing it. That's managing it. So what
Mm-hmm.
is creating it? So when somebody comes into me and they say, I have anxiety, I say, no, that's a symptom. That's not what you
Okay.
have. So many times
Okay.
people
Okay.
identify with their symptom is what they have. And I
Okay.
said, the mind is brilliant. It does everything for a reason. It creates anxiety for a reason. It creates depression for a reason. It creates post-traumatic stress for a reason. It's not doing it because there's something wrong with you. It's doing it for a purpose.
Right. It's doing it to protect you, right?
To protect you 100%. So when people say to me, and this is such a great conversation for addiction, is people will say, I sabotage myself. And what I say to them, it's impossible. You can't sabotage yourself. The brain's not designed to sabotage itself. It's designed to survive. So
Okay.
it's creating a purpose to whatever it's asking for. So whenever you have an emotion, a feeling, a sensation, or a thought, your mind is calling for an action. What is it calling you to do?
Mm-hmm.
Now, in a lot of time in trauma, it's calling for you to do something about the trauma. The problem is the trauma doesn't exist anymore. But the mind, the survival brain, right, your subconscious mind operates in real time. It's fully
Mm-hmm.
present. So it's looking at data from 5 years ago, 10 years ago in real time. So if your mind saw a threat to you, even though it's a threat from memory and it thinks it's real, doesn't it make sense that it would call for an action? The purpose of fear is to escape a threat. The purpose of anger is to attack a threat. So if you think about something that happened to you 5 years ago and your heart's racing, that means your mind is looking at that data in real time, calling for you to run. That's the
Okay.
glitch that I'm talking about. It's an error message.
So I was in a major car accident in 1996, and it was I walked away with a traumatic brain injury. I was in ICU for 3 4 days, 24-hour care for 28 days, transitional living center for brain injured adults. So it was a big deal. And ever since then, and this is again 1996, even still today, I can't fall asleep in a car. Like I
Yeah.
can't sleep in a car. It's not like it's even if I'm going on a long road trip and I'm exhausted, I cannot fall asleep in a car. So would you call that a glitch?
Yes. The reason you can't do that is your mind's trying to protect you, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you go to get into the car, your subconscious is surveying its environment constantly.
Mm-hmm.
So when you get towards a car and you think about falling asleep in a car, what your mind does is basically a Google search. What do
Okay.
we know about falling asleep in cars? Right? And then it starts looking at the data from 1996 and thinks there's going to be a car accident, so it doesn't want to let you sleep. It's
Okay.
trying to keep you awake. That's
Okay.
protection. That's not sabotage.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea is as long as that loop is continuing to play, you will continue to experience that. So what we have to do is reboot the system.
Okay. And so tell me exactly how, and that's where the inspired performance program comes in.
Correct. Yep.
Okay. So tell me exactly how it works.
So the key was to understand where the problem is coming from. It's coming from memory.
Okay.
So trauma is basically a loop that continues to run in real time.
Mm-hmm.
So a simple way to sort of explain it is if I asked you what you ate for dinner last night, can you tell me what you ate for dinner?
Yes.
What'd you have?
I went to Cava and I had a wrap, a pita wrap with
Okay.
lamb.
And so being videoed here, we can see what you did is you looked over to your left, right? And
Oh,
you
I
saw
did I?
pictures, right? Of what, yeah, of what you ate.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And right? Because you saw pictures of what you ate and probably where
Yeah.
you were.
Uh-huh.
That's how you stored the information about dinner last night. Now,
Okay.
because last night's dinner wasn't threatening or disturbing, it's stored as a fairly low resolution file.
Okay.
But only humans store explicit details of events and experiences. Animals don't do that. So we store everything we've ever seen, heard, touched, and experienced in our lifetime has been recorded and stored in this memory system. Now, 95% of your mind, which is your subconscious mind, is
Mm-hmm.
operating in the present, just like the animal mind. Animals are fully present 100%. So
Okay.
everything for an animal is happening now.
Okay.
95% of our mind works just like that. So if
Okay.
95% of your mind is operating in real time and it accesses memory from 1996, when it looks at the data, when does it think it's happening?
Right now.
So if it was happening right now, does it make sense that it would create a response to it?
Yes.
That's the glitch I'm talking about. So
Okay.
what I do and what I've developed is a program that we're going to take that event that you had experienced. All your senses are heightened during a traumatic event: sight,
Mm-hmm.
smell, hearing. So it's
Okay.
recording it in high definition, tremendous amounts of detail and data. So
Okay.
now this high definition data has been recorded and being viewed by the subconscious mind. It's so intense because there's so much detail to it. It then creates a response to it. So what we're going to do is get your mind to reprocess that data into the same format as to what you ate for dinner last night. Then it stops calling for the action. And we can do that very simply.
Okay. And exactly. So what does that look like? The
So we
actual
do a
process.
four-hour program. So in that
Okay.
4 hours, the first 2 hours are really designed to work on the education and science
Mm-hmm.
behind what you're experiencing. So I take a lot of the mystery out of it, right? That's why I say there's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with your mind. If I'd experienced what you had experienced, I'd be experiencing exactly the same thing as you, right?
Okay.
That's just
Mm-hmm.
how our minds work. So people who have had a lot of trauma in their life, that trauma is staying active, constantly creating responses in the nervous system. So your
Okay.
nervous system is being activated on an ongoing basis. It's
Okay.
not meant to do that. It's meant to respond to a current threat. The problem is this glitch keeps on occurring. So what's going to happen is that people are then going to get sicker, right? Because it's going to compromise the system. So your fight or flight response is an emergency management system designed
Okay.
to turn on when there's a threat and turn off when there's no threat.
Okay.
Perfectly designed. It works exactly like that in the animal world.
Okay.
So if a rabbit, for example, gets a sensation of hunger,
Mm-hmm.
rabbit's mind produces a sensation. Why is it producing a sensation? Right? To get the rabbit to eat. Right?
Okay.
So the rabbit starts eating carrots, looks up and sees a wolf. What's going to happen to the sensation of hunger?
It goes away.
Instantly replaced by the more appropriate response to the wolf, which is fear.
Okay. Okay.
Then the purpose of fear is to make rabbit alert and strong, right? More
Mm-hmm.
blood flow to the muscle groups, right? More adrenaline. The rabbit takes off, gets into his rabbit hole, can't see the wolf, hear the wolf, or smell the wolf. What's going to happen to fear? Shuts off,
So it's
right?
off. Yeah.
Perfectly designed system. We have the exact same operating system, but we store details about the events with the wolf. And that
Okay.
continues to activate that nervous system in real time.
So we can't forget the wolf. We think the wolf is still there, even though the wolf is not there.
Yep, the mind is seeing that. Hollywood has made trillions of dollars from this. They can convince us in a movie theater that something's real on the screen because
Okay.
our subconscious mind can't tell the difference between real or imagined. So, you could go into a movie and say, whatever happens, I'm not going to get scared. I know it's just a movie. That's the conscious part of your mind. The 5% of your mind operates on a conscious, logical, reasonable part. It's our intellect. It's how
Okay.
we've created the world we live in: computers, automobiles, airplanes, right? We couldn't do something, we figured out a way to do it. That part of our brain is brilliant, but it's not in charge of survival. The survival is controlled by the subconscious part of the brain. So there's where it continues to get activated because memory continues to run and loop when there's something. So, like you said, when you think about getting into a car and sleeping, right? Your mind says, what
Mhm.
do we know about that? And then starts
Right.
looking at the data and instantly creates a response to it. Does that make
Let's.
sense?
Yep. Yep. So let's use one of your specific examples, or one of the people that you specifically treated, the Boston Marathon bombing attack
Sure.
survivor.
Yep.
let's walk me through
Okay.
that situation.
So when Rebecca came in to see us, she had been
Mhm.
suffering for 5.5 years with post-traumatic stress,
Okay.
terror nightmares every night. So she heard about the program. If you watch her testimonial on our site, she talks about this. She said, I've been struggling for 5.5 years. I'd done traditional therapy and some of that helped a little bit, but she says I was still having the nightmares. She spoke all over the country. So she was
Hmm.
a pretty high profile survivor, but every time she'd go out and speak, it would just drain her because talking about it. So she said, I heard about your program and that you could clear this post traumatic stress in 4 hours. She goes, it sounded too good to be true, but she goes, I was desperate, to try something.
What's what's your website where they can view the testimonial? I'm gonna post it here in the comments.
Yeah. So go to gettip.com, GETTIPP.com. And then you can see the testimonials or the Inspired Performance Institute, either one.
Okay, great.
Yeah. And so when she comes in and she says, I'm desperate. I've been struggling with this for 5.5 years. So as she sits down and we first start to talk, she starts to shake and cry. And I said, Rebecca, do you know why you're shaking and crying? And she says, well, because I'm talking about what happened to me. I says, correct, but your mind thinks there's a bomb about to go off. It's actually trying to protect you. It's
Uh-huh.
creating an emotion to get you into an action to run. But can you run from the bomb now? No. But your mind doesn't know that. It's looking at it in real time.
Okay.
So so I take her through the whole process, give her the education and science behind how the mind's working. Then after about 2 hours, we start working on the trauma. We don't even touch trauma for 2 hours.
Had she tried what had she tried prior to trying your method?
Quite a few things, actually. So she had done a number of things. I'm not sure exactly, but I know the Boston Marathon bombing survivors had tremendous resources, right? A
Okay.
lot of the stuff that they'd been given. Same with the 9/11 people. But
Hmm.
nothing had really, everything was all about managing it,
Uh-huh.
living with it, taking medications for it. But what I was saying is we need to solve it.
Okay.
And that's what I was finding. My daughter didn't get that. My wife didn't get that. So by the time we were finished, she, her nightmare stopped. She didn't have a nightmare again. And that was because the loop stopped. The mind no longer was looking at that. She could talk about it. And so that was in 2018 that we did the process with her. In 2019, she went back to the Boston Marathon. She says, I'm going to go to the marathon. I'm going to stand right where I was when the bomb went off at the exact time.
Hmm.
And she sent me a picture of her standing there saying, this wouldn't have been possible without you. No
Wow.
fear, no crying. It was like joy.
Hmm.
Because before her mind would have said, what do we know about being in this spot? Would have started looking at that data from 6 years earlier and would have gone into an instant state, right? A fight or flight.
Hmm. Gotcha.
So that's what we fix.
Now, how does TIP work in conjunction with traditional treatment modalities like EMDR, for example?
EMDR works. EMDR is a good process. It takes longer.
Hmm.
It tends to be a little more intrusive. You have to go through a lot of the trauma. So generally, in most EMDR sessions, it's 8 to 10 sessions, but
Hmm.
it works. So I give it credit.
Okay.
What I'm able to do is much faster because
Okay.
we're spending 4 intensive hours, right, working on this.
Hmm.
EMDR, basically, you're doing 1 hour at a time. So one of the ways, and Dr. Benjamin Hardy, right?
Yes.
He wanted to go through the program so he could experience it, so he could write about it in Psychology Today. And he
Right.
says, "How are you getting these results like so quick?"
Hmm.
And so after we went through it, and I explained to him, when we have a traumatic event, right? Your brain, right, is in a very high beta state, right? So the,
Hmm.
the major or the dominant brain wave activity is dominant beta, high beta.
Hmm.
In high beta, you're cycling at about 15 to 30 hertz or cycles per second.
Right.
So your mind's taking in tremendous amounts of detail about this event and storing that detail in memory. So what happens is that when I take you through our program, before we start working on the trauma, after 2 hours, you're in
Hmm.
a dominant alpha brainwave state, which is
Okay.
between 7 and 14 hertz. So the
Hmm.
mind is super relaxed and super focused. So by the
Okay.
time we start bringing in some of this traumatic data, your mind is in a restorative mindset. And that's why we can get so much done so quickly. Where
Gotcha.
if you go into traditional therapy, even EMDR, you're tending to be in a higher beta brainwave state when you start to try to process the data. So that's why it's taking longer, because you can only get so much done. The mind is resistant to make change when it's still in that fight or flight state.
Okay. So the first thing you do is get the mind to a state where it's open to accepting the treatment,
Yep.
essentially.
Yep. And what I
Gotcha.
find is between an hour and a half and 2 hours, we're in that very nice deep alpha brainwave state, and the mind is willing to make changes because there's
Okay.
no threat.
Okay. So it takes an hour and a half to 2 hours to get the mind to that state first
Right.
before you actually start addressing the trauma.
We haven't even talked about a trauma for two
Okay.
hours. And
Okay. Okay.
and then even then, we spend very little time. I'll work on 2 or 3 traumas, get the mind to update that. I don't
Mhm.
even need to know what the trauma is. So,
Okay.
for example, if I work with a rape victim, right, the
Mhm.
last thing they want to do is sit there and start talking about something that happened to them when they were a child, or, an assault like that. So
Mhm.
I'll have them do it just visually. So I have no idea what they're seeing. So I can
Okay.
take them through a couple of different processes without ever knowing any details about it.
Okay.
It's the mind that's holding the data. It's not important for me to know it. Just
Gotcha.
important for the mind to get the restoration done.
Okay. What are atmospheric conditions?
So when I talk about that, what I say is you grew up in a particular kind of lifestyle, right? So as a child, you grew up, even as an adult, you continue. Atmospheric conditions are basically the environment that you were growing up in. So
Okay.
if you had a very turbulent, traumatic childhood, your atmospheric conditions would be very dark and stormy.
Okay.
And so that's the childhood my wife grew up in. I
Mhm.
grew up in, for lack of a better word, Florida, right? Sunshine and right,
Uh-huh.
everything was sort of really cool.
Uh-huh.
So if you've lived in those dark, stormy atmospheric conditions for most of your life, that feels normal, right?
Right. I mean, isn't that kind of what people are drawn to? People are
Yes,
drawn to what they know.
what they
It's
know,
like
because it
the
feels
path of
familiar.
it feels familiar. Exactly. Even if it's dark and stormy.
Yes. And so here's what's interesting is the mind wants to feel safe.
Mhm.
So if you've lived in that, you'll be attracted to that because the
Okay.
mind says, I know how to do this. So I use the story of if you walked every day to get food 2 miles, and
Mhm.
along that 2 mile trip, there were snipers and landmines. But every day you got there and you got back. And then somebody goes, well, Tim, why are you doing that? There's a safe way a mile down the road that way, and there's lights and it's very, very safe. Your mind won't want to go that mile because it says, I don't know that's true.
Okay.
So there's where the repetition, and we have to sort of get the brain to start making the adjustments, but it doesn't make instant adjustments. It will on the trauma loop, but it won't on the behaviors. And that's why I'm so excited about what we're doing with addiction, because
Mhm.
there's two memory systems we're working on. We're working on the explicit memory, which is where the trauma, right, has created the glitches, and we can
Mhm.
update that very quickly. Then we want to work on the procedural repetitive memory, which I believe is addiction. And that is a code that got built on the way the mind has responded to the explicit memory pain. And that if you've learned a particular way to stop pain, right, and you repeat it, so
Mhm.
the brain looks at repetition as
Mhm.
research.
Okay.
So if your 95% of your brain, your survival brain, is fully present in the moment, when does it want pain to stop? Now.
Now. Yeah.
So if you take that drug, right, or you take that
Yeah. The
alcohol,
pain
when did it
stops.
stop the pain? Now.
The pain stops now. Right. Right.
That part of your brain cannot see consequences. because in order to
Gotcha.
see consequences, it would have to be able to see time, and
Okay.
it doesn't. So can you see how easily the brain can get stuck into that pattern of behavior because
Right.
it stopped the pain? And then if
Right.
you repeat it, it's building a code for you, right? To say, what do we do when we feel that pain? So it becomes an automatic survival tool. The drugs and alcohol stop the pain.
Right. Right. The drugs and alcohol are a solution.
Yeah,
The any addictive behavior is a solution, and what I've been thinking about is we've 95% of our thoughts are subconscious, as you mentioned earlier. It makes sense that it's so hard for people to get into recovery and stay in recovery long term and stay clean and sober long term, because the easiest thing to do is to go back to what they were doing that made them feel better, because
exactly.
that's how they're programmed.
So I had a lady come in who had been on heroin. She's been in therapy for 7 years, and she comes in and she said, I told my therapist I was coming to see you, and he told me that I have to be honest with you and upfront and let you know I have self-destructive behavior.
Uh-huh.
And so I just smiled at her and I said, really,
Uh-huh.
what would make you think you're self-destructive? And she looks at me and she says, well, I'm sticking a needle with heroin in my arm. Don't you think that's self-destructive? And I said to her, I said, no, I don't. I think you're trying to feel better. And I'll bet you when you stuck the needle in your arm, you felt better. I
Right.
says, now the substance you're using is destructive, but
Mhm.
you're not destructive. I know exactly why you were doing what you were doing. I'd never experienced your pain, your trauma. If I had, I would be finding a resource like you. It's just how our brains work. It's not about your character, willpower, morals, or ethics. It's about the science of how our brains work. It will do whatever it can to get out of pain.
Right.
Pain is a major motivator for the brain. It has two
What
motivations, pain and reward.
which one is a bigger motivator?
Pain, number one.
Right. Right.
Yep, it wants to stop pain. Here's
Right.
a great way to explain it. I found a story about a World War II German sniper, and this explains it. During World War II, when they fought against the Russians didn't have much weapons. They had just people. So
Mhm.
what they would do is the Germans, right, would have all the weapons. The Russians would just charge at the lines, trying to overwhelm them with people. And then what ended up happening is as a sniper, he had to shoot them to kill them, right, to stop them from getting at the line.
Right.
He says, but then another wave would come, and then another wave. And he says, we just had to keep shooting them. He says, then I figured out the way to stop them. He says, I shot them in the stomach. He says, now what happened is when the next wave came, all their comrades were screaming in pain, lying on the
Uh-huh.
ground.
Right.
That was a bigger deterrent than dying.
Ah, okay. That makes
Powerful,
sense.
right?
Yeah. Mhm.
Yep. Death stops the pain. I say the same thing about suicide. I had a lady and a young girl, 16-year-old, with her dad. She had been Baker acted twice for a suicide attempt. And what I said to her is, I said, suicide wasn't about dying. You weren't trying to die. You were trying to stop the pain, and you had no other way to do it. And
Mhm.
her father says, well, that makes perfect sense because both times she did it, she called immediately, right, for some help. She
Right.
didn't want to die. She just wanted to stop the pain,
Right.
and she had no other way to do it. So it's it turns all of that around when you understand why the brain is doing what it's doing. It's trying to survive at all costs in the moment. So can you see how easily addiction, right, can get stuck because you repeated it, your mind then says, what do we do when we feel this pain? It goes to
Well,
the
it's
code that got built.
right, and that's safe and that's comfortable, and that makes them feel better, and they don't think about the consequences, because the consequences are in the future.
And
What
the
they know
only
is that the drugs, the alcohol, the behavior, whatever it is, makes them feel better in the moment. What are emotional concussions?
I talked about that because not everybody has those big T traumas, like
Mhm.
the Boston Marathon, Vegas shooting. We sometimes have and I refer to that because people would call and say, oh, I don't think I have anything like that. So I don't know if this could help me.
Right.
But emotional concussions are those things that happen to us. Maybe a parent that was overly critical, a teacher that told you you're not smart enough, those little tiny comments. You remember Jim Quick was speaking at the Genius Network, right? And he
Yep.
talked
Yep.
about how, if you read his book, he talks about this when a teacher, he did something in front of the class and they laughed because he couldn't remember something. And the
Uh-huh.
teacher made the comment, don't laugh at him. He has a broken brain. Now, she wasn't trying to hurt him, right?
Right.
But that was the way she was trying to explain it. And he said it was at that point he went, "Oh, I'm done. I've got a broken
Right.
brain."
Right.
And that's an emotional concussion. It wasn't an intended trauma, but it emotionally concussed them. And so if you have a lot of those emotional concussions, they're going to accumulate just like a physical concussion would. Like when you talk about your accident, also had two kinds of issues. You had traumatic brain injury, which is the physical, and then
Hmm.
you also had the emotional, right, which was more of a trauma. Then, if you've had something in your lifetime that has been, disturbing, right, then that could be an emotional concussion, and that'll have an effect on your mind.
Have you read the Four Agreements?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, so the author Don Miguel Ruiz talks about black magic.
Mhm.
And so black magic being someone's words. And let's say, for example, a woman or a girl sings and someone and her mother tells her you're a terrible singer.
Right.
So she spends the rest of her life, she doesn't ever want to sing because she thinks she's a terrible singer. Is that considered an emotional concussion?
Absolutely. Yep. Those
Okay.
are exactly those kinds of things. And people
So,
don't recognize it, would say, well, how bad it was that. But
right,
a child doesn't have enough life experience to understand what that means. They weren't
right,
necessarily trying to hurt her,
right,
but they can make those kinds of comments so flippantly that has a major effect on a child. And
right.
so you have to be very, very careful how you say things to children because they're interpreting it with very little life experience.
Right. I mean, that's anything from like you're ugly, you're not a good singer, you're not a good baseball player, you're not slow, or you're not fast, or you're not smart, or you're not good at math, or you're not good at English, or you're not good at history,
Yep.
or anything can cause an emotional concussion, which I can totally see that. And it's the same thing as black magic.
Yeah. And those accumulate.
Mhm.
I had another example of a lady who said, "Oh, I didn't really have any trauma during my life, had a really good childhood." And I said, "Can you think about an event, an experience that was She was actually, we were doing it in front of a group. So she came up to volunteer. And she says, well, she says, I remember when I was about 6 years of age. And she says, we were in church. And I could see her eyes starting to fill up as she was talking about the story. And she says, and I was talking, to my cousins. And my grandmother took out the hairbrush from her purse and hit me on the head and said, stop talking, you're in church. And then the waterworks came. And then when
Wow.
she caught her breath, she says, I lost my voice that day. I
Wow.
never stand up for myself. And she never had realized that before. She said, I let people push me around because what the 6-year-old heard was, we don't want to hear you. We're not
Mhm.
interested in hearing what you have to say. That's not what her grandmother was trying to do,
Right, right,
right?
right, right.
But a 6-year-old, that's what she heard.
So this kind of leads me to my next question. Who is appropriate for the tip method?
Pretty much anybody who's had any kind of an experience, like I said, people who don't feel like they've had any real trauma in their life, those emotional concussions could be playing a role. So you
Mhm.
want to get those updated, and a lot of times people will say, oh, I don't think I really have anything that I would consider traumatic or disturbing. And then when we start getting into it, by the time we get a couple hours in, then they say, can you come up with, all of a sudden these things start showing up,
Right.
right? And then we
What's
can get them addressed.
right? Well, so what? I guess the next question: what's the difference between big trauma and little trauma?
It's relative. So
Okay.
to the same person, so a Boston Marathon bombing event, right, could be the same thing as a teacher telling you you're stupid, right?
Okay.
It can still create that kind of scarring, that kind of an emotion that the mind keeps on looping through. So you
Hmm.
can see if they told you were stupid when you were a kid, and now you're going. My wife was a great example. she had a situation where the teacher put her up in front of the class to start
Mhm.
doing her mathematical tables, like 2 times 5, 6 times 3, and she froze. And
Okay.
everybody, nervously probably were like giggling and laughing, right? And the teacher kept her up there, right, to sort of almost like, I'm going to grill you until you get this. What
Mhm.
my wife heard was, I'm stupid,
Right.
right? And it had nothing to do with that. She's brilliant. She's so smart, but she grew up, especially with that kind of an environment in her home, and then getting those kinds of experiences at school, didn't think she was smart. And yet she's brilliant.
What is anxiety and what is a panic attack?
So
And is it
anxiety is,
possible and is it possible to stop panic attacks?
yeah. In fact, I wrote a patent on how to stop a panic attack, and it looks like
Okay.
we're getting it approved.
Okay.
So
First question, what's anxiety, what's a panic attack? And then we'll talk about how it's possible to stop it.
okay. So anxiety basically is worried about something future based, right?
Uh-huh.
The mind is not feeling safe. It's worried about what's going to happen. So the purpose of anxiety is to put you on hypervigilance, right?
Mhm.
Look out for the danger. We don't know what the danger is, but the danger is coming.
Mhm.
So anxiety is sort of a hypervigilant state. Chances are it's coming from previous experiences that the mind is looking for to see if there's a pattern, and we see it again. So
Okay.
anxiety can be calmed down by calming down the old data that keeps on looping. A
Mhm.
panic attack is actually a little below that, where you're not even aware of it. So a panic attack is a combination of physical and psychological. So the mind is feeling unsafe for whatever reason. It could be
Mhm.
where you are, could be just general stuff, but you're not aware of it. Anxiety, you're aware of. In a
Okay.
panic attack, your mind is feeling unsafe. So it starts to prepare you physiologically for the threat. But again, you're not aware of it. So it starts changing, right? The respiration starts changing the heart rate. So
Mhm.
now you're running lower on oxygen. So the brain gets a message from the body that we need more oxygen. So the brain that was looking for the threat gets a message that there is a threat. We're running low on oxygen. CO2 oxygen is changing. Then
Mhm.
then the body starts burning oxygen from the muscles, which changes the pH of the blood. Another message comes in, the pH is changing. So all these signals are coming from the body to the brain that's already feeling stressed, and it can't find the danger. So it hits the panic button. And people will say that a panic attack came on instantly, but it doesn't. It starts up to an hour before. So
Okay.
that's really what I did with our patent. Is I said, all we need to do is to detect the signs that the mind is doing this rumination, looking for a problem, and it shows up physically. And then we take them to and show them how to shut it down.
Gotcha. Okay. So we talked a little bit about trauma, childhood trauma earlier.
Mhm.
How do these traumas show up later in life?
They're going to show up a couple different ways. One, mentally. So you see a lot of the mental health issues are all really coming from trauma. So the
Mhm.
anxiety, the depression, the post-traumatic stress, those are where they're going to show up, that you can see them, from the mental health standpoint. What
Okay.
is also doing though is affecting physical health.
Okay.
So you'll see a lot of people who have autoimmune, right, have had trauma. And I believe that most autoimmune is being caused by unresolved trauma that continues to affect the immune system and the neurotransmitters. My daughter was a perfect example. She had two autoimmune issues
Mhm.
stemming from childhood trauma that when she was 6 that we were unaware of. We didn't find out until she was 16. And so it shows up physically and emotionally.
Gotcha. Now, how does rebooting the mind help performance? I mean, because you've talked about record performances from uh, people that have gone through your method, and so tell me how rebooting the mind helps performance.
So one of the things that I talk about is the key to performing at your highest level is to be able to stay present and to
Okay.
be able to stay in the moment. So in that very, very relaxed alpha brainwave state.
Hmm.
So what happens is that when we have trauma, unresolved trauma, that will create inflammation somewhere in the body. When we have inflammation, the cells become hardened and inflamed. They go into a cell
Mhm.
danger response.
Mhm.
So the ATP, the mitochondria in the cell, is compromised. It's not going to be released because nothing's getting into the cell when it's in a cell danger response, but nothing's getting out of the cell, including the energy. But it's a temporary pause until the danger passes. Once the danger passes, then it releases and comes out of the cell danger response and goes back into normal cycles.
Mhm.
The problem is, as long as the trauma is active, right, then that energy is not available. When we
Okay.
release the trauma, we release that extra energy. So Marco Cicchetto, who you talked about, was a double amputee. He was a marathon runner before the amputation and then
Mhm.
wanted to start running marathons again. So they built him blades to run on. And
Uh-huh.
then they contacted me and they said, we really think Marco's, got tremendous potential, but he's plateaued.
Mhm.
He's not improving no matter how much physical training he's doing. We believe it's now in his mind. So when Marco came in to see me, 9 days later, he runs in a race and takes 15 seconds per mile off his time, which is
Wow.
big at that level. And
Yeah.
then
Uh-huh.
a few weeks later, he runs in the Boston Marathon in April of 2019 and breaks a world record. And what I said to Marco is, I said, I didn't make you a faster runner. You always had that ability. Your mind was just not letting that energy release. As soon as that energy gets released, you can run faster, right? So that, I believe, is what's happening, is the mind is not allowing the full use of all your power.
Right.
And when we
And
calm the
so how
nervous system down, it releases it.
and how would someone know that they're being slowed down by this inflammation or this trauma? Because everybody has trauma, but how do I know that this trauma is holding me back? Why?
The best way to know whether or not there's a trauma event that's still affecting you is to go to, like you just talked about, your accident. When you think
Yep.
about your accident, do you feel an emotion?
Maybe not really. Not really. I mean, maybe a little bit. It was so long ago. I feel like I've gone past it, but the one time that it really not bothers me, but yeah, I can't sleep in a car because that's what I did. I fell asleep driving and I flipped over 3 times and so that was so I still to this day I can't fall asleep in a car.
So that means it's still active, right?
Right.
And so
Uh-huh.
that's going to affect you. So as long as you can think about an event and you still feel some sort of response or an emotion, then it's
Mhm.
still active. If we don't get that updated, then it's going to continue, right, to affect your performance. So regardless of what it is, it's the best way to sort of figure out whether something, if I ask somebody, tell me about a particular event in your lifetime, as soon as they start choking up or starting to feel their heart racing, then
Mhm.
that means that their mind is actually still actively trying to resolve. That's the
Huh.
best way to know.
What are other ways that someone can work through or process their trauma besides the tip method?
Well, I said EMDR
Mhm.
is a good one. There's a few other trauma programs out there so that you could use. I find that ours is, the fastest, seems to be very, very effective. Um,
Mhm.
Cognitive behavioral therapy just takes a long time. I don't really
Mhm.
think it's very effective. What cognitive behavioral therapy is really good at is dealing with current issues, current stresses,
'Kay.
maybe a relationship issue, something that you're dealing with on an ongoing basis. Where trauma, I think, needs to be specialized in getting that done. Then cognitive behavioral therapy is going to be much more effective.
Okay.
Going to your therapist and be able to talk through things.
Why would someone want to go through your process?
If they're really dealing with, the kinds of things I was just talking about, they don't feel like they're performing at their highest level. They're having constant stresses in their life. So if you have, I mean, we can't get rid of stress completely in our lives because stress is
Right.
part of our lives. But if you have current stress, but you also have this trauma loop going, then it's much worse. It's almost
Mhm.
magnifying it. So if you can get rid of that old stress and get that updated, now you can deal with the current stress a lot better. Because like I said, everybody's going to still deal with life. Life's going to keep coming at us. Um, Anybody who wants to perform at a higher level, if he wants to improve your relationships. So it really does help a lot with relationships, because you think about, if you come into a relationship with your atmospheric conditions and your partner comes in with their atmospheric conditions, can you see how easily they could start to collide? And then you
Right.
say something that then activates their atmospheric conditions. And then before you know it, you're not talking or you're fighting.
Right.
And that's what we can help with.
Okay.
So can really help in that area as well.
Is there? We're coming to the end of the hour here. What is there? Is there a question that you've always wanted to be asked, but the interviewer never got around to it?
Oh,
And
wow. That's like an Oprah question. Gee, off the top of my head, I can't think of anything that would be that I haven't been asked. I've been asked so many different kinds of questions. You know, I think probably the best thing that I could sort of say is it really that easy? That's probably, it sounds too good to be true. I mean, if you listen to Rebecca, that's exactly what she said. It sounded too good to be true that you could do this in 4 hours. Um, but when you understand the science behind it, like that's what, Dr. Benjamin Hardy wanted to hear about, right? And then he goes,
right.
now I get it. That makes perfect sense to me, why you're able to get that kind of result so quickly, right? Nobody had ever really thought about that before. So, it really is that simple. Our minds and bodies are designed to heal. What's interfering with it is the mind is so actively going over and trying to resolve this trauma that it doesn't want to do maintenance. It wants to do minimal maintenance because it wants all that energy to be working on resolving this trauma. So when you relieve that, health improves. So my daughter, I told you, had Crohn's. She also
Mm-hmm.
had idiopathic pulmonary hemosiderosis, which is a lung
Mm-hmm.
disorder, both autoimmune. Ever since going through the program, both of those have gone.
Okay.
And those were, I believe, direct relationships to her trauma.
Now, if someone wanted to go through your process, how could they find you? Like, I guess first off, do they need to do it in person, or can it be via Zoom, or what's the best way to go through the
Yeah.
Inspired Performance Program?
They can come to Orlando and do it one-on-one with me, or if I happen to be in their area, I've done that as well when I'm there, or they can
Mm-hmm.
do it via Zoom. So I do Zoom
Mm-hmm.
sessions with people all over the world. The other thing is, in order to scale this to reach as many people as possible, I developed an online version of this. So it's a
Mm-hmm.
video, 4-hour video program that's the
Mm-hmm.
identical session that I do, but
Mm-hmm.
it's all in video modules.
Is that just as effective?
Yes, I mean we get the only issue that we have sometimes with that is getting people to stick with it for 4 hours. When they're sitting with me one on one, I can keep them focused.
Right.
And so the only issue sometimes we'll have is if somebody will come back and say, well, I started and then my kids and I have to do this and then I'm going to go back to it, and finish the rest of it tomorrow. It doesn't work like that. The
Right.
idea is to stay in that 4 hours. So that's the only issue that we sometimes have with the online version, is people being able to sit there. You've got to have a discipline to be able to sit there for 4 hours by yourself.
Gotcha. Okay. Where can people find you, or where can people learn more about how to take it, get involved with your program or go through your process?
If you go to gettip.com, and I think we're offering a free my book as a free download. If you go there, I think that's going to be in your show notes, right, Tim, on how
Yep.
to get that. And then you can also, I think there's going to be a discount if anybody wants to do the online program or the one-on-one. So if you're listening to the podcast and it sounds like of interest to you, then go to that site, and it'll be able to guide you all the way through it. But you can definitely get the book for sure.
Okay. Awesome. Well, Dr. Wood, thank you so much. I appreciate you. I appreciate your time, and I hope you have a great rest of your day, rest of your week.
You too. All right. Great seeing you again, Tim.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.